I'm Steve Haynes. I'm the head of program for Mates in Mind, and I'm going to be talking this afternoon about tackling mental health in the workplace. We're going to cover a number of themes. We're going to cover, well, actually, two key themes. First, of course, we're going to be looking at what are we tackling when we're addressing mental health in the workplace. And we're also going to be talking about building cultures of we've got each other's backs in the workplace. So two key areas. So before we get going, let's just think a little bit about what we mean by mental health. And just like our physical health, our mental health fluctuates along a spectrum. We might have a condition that might be recognizable in a scope of medical diagnostic criteria. Conversely, we might have a number of things going on in our lives which are affecting how we think, how we're feeling, and what we're doing and how we're acting. We might have a diagnosed mental health condition, but still have good mental well-being. Equally, we might not have any diagnosed condition, but have poor mental health. Humans are really complex, and what goes on in our heads is very unique to each and every one of us. Simplistically, a mental health problem is generally defined when poor mental health continues for a prolonged period of time. According to the World Health Organization, the lifetime prevalence of any kind of mental health disorder now is much higher than previously thought and affects nearly half the population. But despite being common, mental illness is underdiagnosed by doctors. Less than half of those people that meet a diagnostic criteria for mental health disorders are actually identified. People are also reluctant to seek professional help. It's also estimated that around 2 in 5 people will experience a mood or anxiety or a substance use disorder, and only around 2 in 5 of those will actually seek help in the year of onset. And the rates of mental health disorders are pretty similar for men and women, but there are gender differences in the patterns of mental illness. Different factors, stresses, pressures in our lives will all affect each of us in different ways. We all have different belief systems, different personality traits, different life experiences. Some of us have stronger coping mechanisms. Some of us are able to adapt very well or more readily than others to change. Some have stronger resilience skills than others, and we've all got very different protective factors. So when it comes to our mental health, we're not all the same, and we should never assume or judge how different things in life will affect someone else, and certainly not by our own experiences or value system. That's really important. Ultimately, our mental well-being impacts how we think, how we feel, and what we do. So collectively, the mental well-being of our workforce drives how well our business performs. So how can we effectively address mental health in our businesses? Simplistically, at one end of the spectrum, it's about maintaining good mental health, helping people thrive in what they do, identifying and mitigating work stresses. At the other end of the spectrum, it's about ensuring we've got the right support infrastructure in place to ensure our people get help at the right time. And a lot of the focus around addressing mental health in the workplace historically has tended to be more to the right. And as organizations mature in their approach, it's started to take a more broader approach. So let's think about the scale of mental health issues in the workplace pre-lockdown. We already knew depression and anxiety, the two most common mental health disorders, were accounting for best part of half of all work-related illness or sickness absence. We know a high proportion of people within workplaces are still giving different reasons for absence that relate to their emotional health or stress or work or mental health. And that'll be for a variety of different reasons. Culture, whether I feel more comfortable doing that or not, do I feel supported from my team, my manager, etc., etc. There are various gender-specific risks for common mental health disorders, which disproportionately affect different people, particularly women. Gender is that fundamental determinant of someone's exposure to drivers of mental illness. And this includes everything from our circumstances, our social status, social position, how we're treated, as well as our susceptibility to mental health issues. Gender isn't historically really focused, given the focus it needs to, around addressing mental health in workplaces. And whilst there aren't really that many marked gender differences in the rates of severe mental health disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, for example, There are numerous gender-specific risk factors for common mental health disorders which disproportionately affect women. For example, depression is the most common mental health problem in women, and some believe it's much more persistent in women than men. Major depressive disorder is the second leading cause of global disability, and this is twice as common in women. There are also various risk factors that disproportionately affect women for common mental health issues, such as violence, income inequality, social status, rank, responsibility and care for others, for example. We also see gender bias in the diagnostic and the diagnosis of, and treatment of mental health issues. If, for example, doctors are still more likely to diagnose depression in women, even when they present with similar or identical symptoms. Generally, women are much more likely to seek help and talk about issues than men. Also, the mental health impact of long-term cumulative psychosocial factors in both men and women is an area that needs much more research. And of course, finally, in our industry, we have one of the highest rates of suicide by industry. In construction, it's estimated to be up to 3.7 times higher than the national average. And we know that a high proportion of people that tragically see no other way out, that tragically complete suicide, had not been in contact with local mental health services in the year before they died. So let's think a bit about where we are now and what's on people's minds. The latest ONS data, which examines the link between the pandemic and depression, which compares the same group of adults over a 12-month period, which looks at depressive symptoms pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, showed that around 1 in 5 adults are much more likely to be experiencing some form of depression during the pandemic, and that was back in June. This had doubled from about 1 in 10 in last summer. About 1 in 8 develop moderate to severe depressive symptoms, but equally around 1 in 25 had actually seen an improvement in their mental health. The pandemic's also accelerated trends that were already well underway relating to the migration of things like work to online or virtual environments. And of course, working from home has always been responsive to employee preferences, but the pandemic's forced many of us into this mandatory work from home. And the practicalities of working from anywhere have really been tested to the full. Whether that's changing or adapting workspaces at home, we've faced issues from establishing and maintaining boundaries between work and non-work, that lack of commute, and in many cases, which would have before provided that transition between home and work, to the lack of clearer delineation between work week and our weekend. And of course, not to mention the impact on family life, schooling and relationships. So has the pandemic accelerated the importance of work well-being? In our experience in Mates, I would say absolutely. A proportion of our supporters that we work with have all observed that, yes, whilst we're very much in uncharted territories and uncertain times, it has put well-being first and foremost on the agenda. A lot of that has come down to actually we're able to talk more. We're much more open. It's easier to engage with channels within the business that we would have found harder to previously, particularly in supply chains. We're not having to sell. The importance of well-being is certainly a key theme that we've seen come through a lot. So let's just think for a second about when we're addressing mental health at work, what do we mean? So we talked at the beginning about the spectrum. At the one end, it's about creating environments where people thrive. At the other end, it's about creating environments where we are supporting people at points of need. And when we think about addressing mental health at work, one common way of looking at it is to break it into primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. Tertiary interventions is about focusing on the treatment, getting people back to work, supporting people at point of need. Secondary interventions are about promoting well-being by upskilling people, stress management, resilience training, for example, whilst primary interventions are essentially the key about they look at work organization, they look at job quality, they look at the wider physical environment and the culture of the workplace. It's about identifying work-related stresses, the exposures to stress, and mitigating them. And arguably, this is 80% of the game in addressing mental health. Interestingly, if we go back 5 to 10 years, the focus was still very much on tertiary. And to a large extent, it still is as organizations start to mature further in their approach. So what do we mean by understanding the maturity? you can look at it quite simplistically from this perspective in terms of looking at the way in which organizations have addressed historically. You could almost argue that, the more we understand about our people and our business, the more mature our approach will be to addressing mental health and well-being. And we've been working with organizations since 2017, taking on this journey to help increase their understanding of mental health and well-being. And ultimately, their level of maturity in addressing mental health is continuing to grow. So where are we now, and where do we want to be going as an organization? So simplistically, one way in which we do this within Mates in Mind is we help group organizations almost into those very, very light touch categories of getting started, developing and leading the way. Your organization is more likely to be at the getting started stage if your focus is on provision of tertiary support at point of need, i.e. more non-integrated support services like EAP and OH, or psychological first aid models such as mental health first aid trained, whereas they're not necessarily looking at the broader areas. So you might be more likely to be in the developing or leading the way stage if your business does things like regularly identify exposures to work stresses and understand how those work stresses link to employee health and well-being and the bottom line of the business. Another way to look at it is to use the age-old plan, do, check, act model. So ultimately assess the business, both at an organizational level and an employee level. Understand, what works, what doesn't work, what communication channels do we have, what methods, what are our absence policies, what is our approach, what does our support infrastructure look like? Understand our people, undertake stress, risk, or well-being assessments to better understand and identify the prevalence of the risks and the exposures to stress risks within the workplace. Combined, the more information we have, the better able we are to create much more informed program designs. A high proportion of mental health and well-being initiatives in workplaces are not based on informed data. So it's really critical. Again, that helps us better design a much more appropriate approach for our business. It helps us ensure we've got an optimized support infrastructure. So ensuring things like our employee assistance program aligns with our occupational health, ensuring our managers are better equipped to manage refer into the EAP, ensuring our managers and our colleagues are better equipped to spot and identify. We've got to recognize that just because things like EAPs and occupational health services exist or are in place, we should never assume people will automatically use them. We know from our experience that people are much more likely to reach out to those closest to them, if of course they do reach out for support, than they would be necessarily to reach out to professional support services, which brings into question, I think a lot of the approach and focus of addressing mental health and work hasn't necessarily really reflected or really taken on board human behaviors and what we actually do when we're struggling. Where do we really go and what do we do? So it's important that we recognize who is that front line of defense. And of course, making sure we've got a clear and consistent approach to monitoring and reviewing. So that's looking at all of our data sets, whether it's our EAP outputs, our OH outputs, our attendance management data outputs, our exit interview data, our employee engagement data, our stress risk assessment data, et cetera, et cetera. Each different element will give a different part of the picture. Together, they'll provide a more informed picture. And that's really, really important. And then, of course, making sure we've got clear central program management. Optimal programs work where you've got someone that's pulling all the different areas together and is informing the relevant parts of the business so we can make strategic decisions. So just closing on the second part, let's think about this whole concept of we've got each other's back. We run a global pandemic at the moment. It's affecting each and every one of us in very, very different ways. One of the most important things we could do in our workplaces is to engender this culture and build on this culture of we've got each other's backs. And let's just think about Who is the front line of wellbeing management in any business? And contrary to historical practice in addressing mental health at work, support services such as helplines, occupational health are not the front line of wellbeing in your business. They do play a critical, instrumental role as part of a wider piece. Your leaders and managers are the front line of wellbeing management. Managers are best placed to be able to create those environments where people can thrive. Managers are often the first people to spot issues, and if they're equipped and are comfortable doing so, they're able to better address and support people and make sure they're signposted to the right support services as needed. Management behavior, as we know, can help or hinder how we feel. And of course, they are at first line of support often and a key gateway to referring on to the appropriate support services. What should we be looking out for if we're concerned about a colleague or co-worker? Now, before we go through this entire list here, I think probably the most important thing we want to be thinking about is change. Just looking for changes in people's normal emotions and behaviors. If one of my team is normally calm and collected, but recently they've become much more irritable or isolated or withdrawn, for example, I need to be exploring what's on their mind. I need to be having a conversation with them. If my team came to me and said, "Oh, yeah, Steve, I've been binge watching Netflix every night for the past week," but I know that member of the team. I know that's unusual behaviour for them. So I might want to explore that further. Well, Dave, is that normal for you? I mean, do you find yourself doing that often? It might be that actually that's his or her way of starting a conversation about, actually, I'm not sleeping at the moment. I've got so much going on in my head. I'm really worried. I'm really anxious. I'm feeling really low, whatever that might be. But that might be the way in which that person makes that conversation, starts that dialogue with you. So looking out and progressing those conversations is really important. Checking frame of reference, exploring those issues. And how do we approach that conversation? Critically, we've got to think about also barriers to support. There are a wide number of barriers to support. Do I acknowledge myself that I might be struggling? Who would I talk to? How would I talk to someone? Could I possibly express what's going on in my head to somebody else? And what might others think of me? It's estimated that around 2/3 of business leaders have struggled from mental health issues at some point. One of the reasons they don't come forward is this perception that mental health problems may impact their ability to lead. We know that generally that we're much more likely to approach someone closer to us at the first point before we reach out for professional support. Many find it easier to spot changes and issues in other people before necessarily acknowledging or recognizing issues in themselves. And again, just because help's available, we shouldn't assume that people will reach out. So when we're approaching that conversation, when we reach out to someone, is everything okay? Things we want to think about is, A, never bring judgment into this. Always use open questions. Avoid the whys. Well, why would you feel that way? I don't feel that way. Focus on the hows. How is it affecting you? What's different for you? We want to help people identify how to have the same but different. We want to listen, and we need to avoid solutions. And we've got to accept, as I think we do, that things are tough. Things are different right now. And think about listening skills as well. Listening is an essential part of helping anybody. But of course, body language, which of course is absolutely critical and key in it, we don't necessarily all have that same luxury at the moment of personal contact. So we've got to think about those signals we might be giving off by phone or video conference. We all know when someone is distracted, when someone is typing on a keyboard in the background, or when they're distracted on with something else and not giving you full attention. You can tell that by video, and we can tell that by phone. So we've got to be 110% there for someone in those conversations. Also think about listening to understand. Listening to understand is getting us to silence our own opinions and solutions and just focus on why someone might feel that way. We're not there to judge. We're not there to critique. We should strive to build rapport instead before fixing any problems. So starting a conversation is absolutely critical. And I think equally it's instilling these very, very light touch, basic principles of what we would call psychological first aid across every organization is really important. Everyone can and should be doing it non-judgmentally or asking open questions. We don't have to have solutions. We're using empathy rather than sympathy. We're there to comfort and connect them to information and support. We're not there to judge. We're not there to pressure them. And equally, we're there to recognize what our boundaries are as well. At what point do we then hand that individual over to maybe if we have mental health first aiders in the workplace? At what point might we suggest, have you spoken to your doctor? At what point might we say, have you spoken to your manager? Or perhaps have you spoken to HR or our employee assistance program? Well, if we don't have that, the fantastic support of the construction industry helpline, for example. So in closing, it's really critical that we don't create boundaries between support services, but we recognize what those differences are and the roles and responsibilities, and recognizing that each and every person in your business plays an equally important role in supporting mental health. I may be more likely to reach out to my colleague before calling a helpline because that's just my nature. Someone else may be much more likely to reach out to their manager. Someone else may be more likely to do absolutely nothing. And actually, that's that person that we need to look out for. It's that person that we need to reach out to and say, I'm worried about you. Can we talk? So creating these environments where each and every one of us is empowered, but equally making sure everybody fully understands the support services that are there. Take a note of them, equip yourself, become familiar with all the support that's there so that when you're having that conversation, when you are concerned about someone, you know what's out there and how to signpost people to. So when we think about our mental health, one size does not fit all. It's very unique to each and every one of us. We've got to create these environments where we identify and prevent stress at work, spot the signs and start conversations and build on our cultures of we've got each other's backs. Thank you.